The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
Welcome from the General Assembly in the City of Richmond. I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. We are honored to have two members of the House of Delegates from the General Assembly here today. Delegate Jennifer McClellan, welcome.
Thank you, Woody.
Delegate Joe Morrissey, good to see you again, sir.
Woody, good to be back.
Give us the lay of the land. Things have started off with a bang, and I know there's a lot of stuff going on.
Jennifer, you want to do it first, or do you want me to?
Can you go ahead?
You know, we started off, Woody, a little bit outnumbered in the House.
A little bit is an understatement.
It is. It is. But here's the key that I share with all my constituents and people that come by, and it's really, I think, I'm speaking for all of our caucus, we believe that there are a lot of core democratic principles and values that we need to continue to articulate. And we need to do it by being prepared, being right on those issues, and fighting the good fight in the House chamber. And we're all doing that, you know. And I've said this, and it's the last point that I'll make. If we get some really far, you know, I think far to the right legislation that's passed, people are going to come back and say, wait a second, we need to make some changes in 2013. And that's what's going to probably, hopefully, keep the folks on the other side of the aisle grounded and more centered.
Now, to what extent, if any, has your district been affected by redistricting?
You know, basically it stayed the same. I lost a wonderful Ratcliffe precinct, and Jennifer picked it up, and I also picked up one of hers. But basically, I continue to represent 80% of eastern Henrico County and all of Charles City County. I lost Hopewell. You know, I loved Hopewell, and it's just, you know, it's part of that redistricting. And you know, Woody, because we've had lots of talks about it, the whole process is flawed because it allows incumbents to protect themselves, it discourages challengers, and it makes for a more polarized body. You got, you know, people to far left and far right, and we don't have the moderates, and that's the problem.
So the politicians pick their constituents versus the constituents picking their politicians.
Well, you couldn't have put it better. How disgraceful that occurs. And we don't have competitive districts.
Now, what about your committee assignments? You mentioned health that you had just come from. Has anything changed in that regard?
No, I'm still on HWI and education, and I like that because I'm a former teacher, and I love the bills that come before HWI because I really feel like I can, you know, watch out for the little guy.
Delegate McClellan, tell us about things going on in your district and any changes as a result of redistricting.
Sure. The core of my district stayed the same, the northeast corner of the city. I lost a piece of the fan, moved further up into the east. My district was one of the, or still is, a minority-majority district, but my voting age African-American population had fallen to 42% because of all of the revitalization of downtown, the growth of VCU, and so I had to move that population back up. But the district didn't change too much. I was already the most Democratic district in the state at 71%. Now I remain the most Democratic at 81%.
And you're still on courts of justice?
I'm still on courts of justice, commerce and labor, and education.
Now, what about a bipartisan commission to draw district lines? Is that something you think is a reasonable effort?
I do. I think it is a reasonable effort. And my only quibble with the governor's bipartisan redistricting panel is I think the timing of when their recommendations came out it was too late. What a lot of people don't realize is, I mean, you are really looking census block by census block, which in some cases is street by street, block by block, trying to assign people to different districts. If you are not careful, you can cut neighborhoods in half. One of the maps that was originally introduced literally would have segregated Churchill. And so you need to be sure that once they have their guidelines and their general recommendations, that the delegates and the senators and communities of interest have the time to fully digest what they're recommending. And unfortunately, with the governor's proposal, the panel's proposal, we didn't have the time to really analyze it.
Now, what results from other states in terms of bipartisan commissions who have drawn lines do we have as good examples?
Well, those states that have engaged in bipartisan redistricting. What that means, what your audience needs to know, that means the politicians stay out of it. You give it to a commission and you say to the commission, draw districts that are compact, that are contiguous, that have communities of interest, take all the politics out of it, and they're better. I saw Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, last Saturday at the forum, and he was asked, he served 7 presidents, Republican and Democratic presidents, what one thing would you do in Congress to make it a better body? He said, by far and away, the best thing I could do is have nonpartisan redistricting commissions, because what we have in Congress right now, we have polarized the House. Republicans on this side, D's on here, and no moderates. And that prevents you from compromising. And I agreed with him 100%.
Well, speaking of polarization and minority representation, there's a bill that quickly passed the House this week that's pending in the Senate dealing with congressional redistricting. Speak to us about the issues there.
Sure. I think we had Joe and I both spoke against that bill, and in particular because looking at it does 2 things. It makes all of the current districts much more safe for the incumbents. So we called it the Incumbent Protection Plan. But 2, in my opinion, I think Joe would agree, it packs more of the minority community into the 3rd congressional district. And minorities now make up, African Americans I think are 20% of the population. When you add all the other minorities, it's significant enough that we ought to have another majority, if not district, then a minority influence district. And yet that plan guarantees that for the next 10 years, the minority community in only 1 of 13 congressional districts will have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. Another reason I was concerned at how fast it went out. And the justification for that was, well, it's the same bill that we passed, earlier in the year, but we've got 16 new members of the House of Delegates, I think 9 new members of the Senate. They didn't have the time to look at the plans previously and talk about it and listen to the debate. And I think you get elected here not to just rubber stamp what your caucus wants you to do or what your predecessor might have done, but you need to take the time and look at the bill. But that bill was flown through committee. There was nobody there to speak to or against it. It was put on the supplemental calendar Wednesday night on first reading so that it would be debated the next day. There was really no reason to rush it. And finally, it was probably unconstitutional because the Constitution is pretty clear that you have to do redistricting in a year that ends with a 1, 2011, and we waited too late.
So it's likely to pass the Senate because now the Lieutenant Governor has a tie-breaking vote there.
There's no question it'll get through there. But at the end of the day, what you've got with all of the congressmen, Republicans and Democrats, they protected themselves. Made sure that their districts remained favorable to them, and that's not the way it should work, Woody. I certainly echo what Jennifer said, but this should not be a business of politics where you have a seat for as long as you wanted. Competition is great. It's good. It raises the level of advocacy in the chamber. It makes you a better public servant. It makes you a better server of your constituents. But if you have a safe district, you're not challenged, and that's why it's wrong. And so let me be real clear. The Democrats are wrong and the Republicans are wrong to protect themselves. Let's make competitive seats. And there's 2 cases that are pending right now in Richmond Circuit and in the Federal District of the Eastern District of Virginia. And I made a few remarks the other day on why I thought it was unconstitutional. And let's see what those judges have to say about that.
Well, we'll keep following that, and please keep us informed. Voter ID is another significant issue that's likely to come up in this session. Tell us what's going on with that.
Sure. There are a lot of bills that are really voter suppression bills, but I think the most pernicious are the ones that would require a government-issued photo ID to vote. And a lot of people who were born, after Jim Crow may look at that and say, well, what's the big deal? It's to fight voter fraud. First of all, there's no evidence that there is rampant voter fraud in Virginia, and even in the committees, nobody can present any. But what a lot of people don't realize is to get a government-issued photo ID, you need a birth certificate. Well, if you were born anywhere in the United States, but particularly in Virginia before the end of World War II, and you are not white, chances are you don't have a birth certificate. And that's, in Virginia, there was a man named Dr. Plecker who was in charge of issuing birth certificates, And under the laws we had, if you didn't come in and say you were white or you were colored, he wouldn't give you a birth certificate. So you had people who were of mixed race. You had Native Americans who refused to check the colored box. He refused to give them a birth certificate. So what are they supposed to do? And even every government-issued photo ID requires you to pay. That is a poll tax. And the Supreme Court has made clear you should not have to pay to vote. And the problem is very few people remember our history. And they look at these bills and say, well, this is not a big deal. You know, anybody can get a voter ID or a photo ID, but look at our history and you'll understand this has a disproportionate impact on the elderly and minority communities.
And of course, that's why Virginia is still subject to the Voters' Rights Act and the review by the Department of Justice.
Right. Jennifer's done a great job articulating on the House floor why the photo ID is, you know, an extension in some ways of Jim Crow. An excellent job. But let me give you another example. I had a dear friend. She passed at 94. Her name was Myrtle, and she lives out in eastern part of the county in Verina. She would exercise her franchise and the ability to vote every time she could, but it got to a point where she needed me to drive her up there. But she no longer had a photo ID because she lost her driver's license. She has no idea where her birth certificate is. She would not have been able to vote, and she took great pride in voting in every primary and every election. And like Jennifer said, there's not a scintilla of evidence that there's voter fraud out there. And what's ironic is that whereas you can go online and get a concealed gun permit, you don't need a photo, but we're making it so onerous and so many hurdles to jump through to be able to vote. It's almost silly. And Woody, I challenge anybody out there in the listening audience, name one instance where there's voter fraud. You know, Jennifer, can you imagine somebody saying, you know, honey, at the dinner table, I think I'm going to get a fake photo, or I'm going to use this registration card, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to vote for somebody next Tuesday who I really am not allowed to vote. I mean, it's silly.
Particularly when you are doing so at the risk of a felony conviction, yeah, and you will lose your right to vote for the rest of your life.
So what's the practical impact of all of this?
The practical impact will be to disenfranchise the elderly and African-American voters, which, you know, some argue is by design.
What about long-term school expulsion? I know that's another issue that you've been involved in recently.
That's right. There's a lot of concern about the disproportionate use of long-term suspension and expulsion for minor infractions, like you can be expelled or suspended if you bring your cell phone to school. And studies have shown that the longer you are out of school, there's a correlation with dropout rates. There's also a correlation with being recruited for gang violence, and we need to take a better look at disciplinary processes in our schools. I've got a package of bills to do that, and I'm having some conversations with the stakeholders in the school communities to try to do a better job, because right now long-term suspension and expulsion is not a deterrent. All it's doing is holding some of our kids back.
Now, under the current process in the schools, are there any due process requirements before expulsion or long-term suspensions can occur?
I mean, technically there are, but in some of our schools where we have a zero-tolerance policy, you know, it may be due process to say, well, did you really have, you know, this item in your pocket? But we've had situations where you will have a kid who comes to school, you know, may have a prescription drug or Tylenol in their pocket, in their coat pocket. Don't know, forget, come into school, and they're expelled or suspended because it's a zero tolerance for drugs. Or there was a case I heard where a kid had brought a butter knife to cut his peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Zero tolerance, that kid's kicked out. And I think we need to I mean, technically that's due process, but it's not fair.
Sure. I want to talk, you can comment on that, but I want to talk about the environment with you as well, but go ahead.
One comment on Jennifer's education package. I'm a former teacher, and I understand the necessity when you have a class to not have it disrupted, be able to teach 29 kids who are desirous of learning versus one who might be disruptive and who might have done something that warrants an expulsion or suspension. But here's the key. Is there an alternative? Sure. Maybe have a school or a separate building that those folks that have been suspended or expelled can go to so that they are not just tossed out, never to come back or to be permanently kind of, I don't know, tarred and feathered, for lack of a bit more artful phrase.
It's almost like the policy, if a young lady got pregnant, she was kicked out of school years ago.
Yeah, and what a very short-sighted vision that is, because that student who has a child may be very desirous of going on to higher ed, and to allow her to continue to go to school, and some schools have facilities where the children can receive daycare. It's very visionary, and I think that's some of the things you want to do with your package of bills. Let's not toss these kids out and say, we're giving up on you. Maybe remove them from the class, but put them in an environment where they can still learn and earn the right to come back to the classroom.
Right. Absolutely. Now, talk to us about the environment, because I know you've got some important legislation pending.
I've got a couple. You know, Woody, one of my pet bills are the cigarette butt bill, where, and I can't tell you in the last couple of weeks, partly because it's perhaps gotten a lot of publicity, the number of people, staunch Republicans, a secretary and the governor's administration that came up to me and go, I love it. You know, they can't stand when people flick cigarette butts out of their cars or arrive at an intersection and dump it. And it's not going to get through the House this year, maybe because but you know what's liable to happen? Next year, a Republican will pick up that bill, and that's fine. That's great, because it's a good bill. And Woody, let me tell you, do you know what the number one pollutant in the Chesapeake Bay is? Number one.
I don't.
Cigarette butts.
Really?
Yes. We put over 8 Olympic-size swimming pools full of cigarette butts in the bay and in our tributaries every year. They take 12 years to disintegrate, and they've got, carcinogens like cadmium, arsenic, lead in it. Let's stop it, and other states have done it, and they've been fortunate to do that. My other bill is my plastic bag bill. I'm going to keep bringing it until it passes, because every year in the Commonwealth we put $2 billion, that's with a B, plastic bags in landfills, and it takes 50 years to decompose. And we've got over 26 states, 34 countries, Washington, D.C., and one of the counties in Maryland,
Montgomery County,
thank you, have enacted plastic bag bans, and they've reduced it by 80, 90%, and not a single jurisdiction in the country or in the world that banned it reversed it, and they're delighted with it.
Right.
Let's get ahead of the curve.
Sticking with education, the governor has proposed using some sales tax revenues to help fund education. Where are you on that issue?
Absolutely opposed to it. First of all, it's not going to be enough money to really make a dent in the transportation system, but the money that you're going to divert away from education, health and human services, and public safety is going to make a dramatic impact, particularly when you combine that with some of the other cuts that are being made. And the Democrats have consistently opposed any efforts to divert general fund money away from the core services and towards transportation, and we'll continue to oppose that.
So robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you take money out. There's no question that transportation is the core service. Yeah, we've got to do it. But here's the problem. And again, we've had Democrats and Republicans over the last many years that haven't, some have tried, but they haven't been successful. We patch the road problem. Every year we patch it. The governor had a good plan with the borrowing, but at the end of his term, there's no more money left. And we need a sustained source of revenue. And here's the ironic thing, Woody. There's talk about doing tolls. Some tolls would be $2 each way, $4 a day, $20 a week, $1,000 a year. Now, why don't we just have a gasoline tax, 10 cents? It costs the average driver $60 a year. But my caveat would be, if you did that, you have to have a lockbox on it and make sure that every dime, every dollar raised with that gasoline tax goes to road and rail and bridge maintenance and construction.
Why do those two words that start with a T have such different significance? They assess money from the public. I guess one of the arguments is for tolls, the people who use the roads pay for them.
That's a great point. When they say tax, oh my God, some people, I don't want that tax. But toll, people think to themselves, well, I can avoid that toll. But what's the difference if I've got to take $100 out of this pocket to pay tolls, or take $100 out of this pocket to pay a gasoline tax? But by the way, it's not that. It's $1,000 to pay toll, and it's $60 to pay a gasoline tax. The Republicans just don't like the word tax. There's no incentive, Woody. I don't represent a wealthy district. Why would I want to create a burden for my folks that it's not the most wealthy district in the state? But I'm telling you, when I explain to people the value and the benefit of going with the gasoline tax, inevitably 90–95% of my people say, yep, we'll go with the gasoline tax, Joe. Just make sure that it all goes to road maintenance.
Well, of course, go ahead.
And I would just add to that, the tolls will only work if you can put them up in a way where they can't be avoided. But a lot of people have already said, and truckers have already said, you put tolls on 95, I'm going down Route 1. They will find another road to go down that is not currently designed to handle that kind of traffic, and then those roads will need to be maintained. So all you're doing is shifting the problems from 95 to Route 1 and some of our secondary roads that can't handle it. It's going to cost you even more money to fix it.
And of course, the gas tax hasn't been raised since 1986.
Exactly.
As I recall.
And in the surrounding areas, the gas tax in all of the surrounding jurisdictions is higher than it is here, but the average gas prices for all of those locations in Virginia is the same.
And of course, we have a lot of tourists who visit us, use their cars, use our roads.
Yep.
Right, and that's a burden on the Commonwealth.
Yep.
Jennifer made a point a moment ago that sometimes is overlooked, but it's a crucial point. Our gasoline tax is less than Pennsylvania, Maryland, District of Columbia, and North Carolina. But the pump price in northern North Carolina and the southern part of Virginia is the same. What's happening is the petroleum manufacturers are in essence subsidizing it. We would be doing ourselves a service, a tremendous service, because we're leaving money on the table if we raise the gasoline tax a nickel or a dime and then index it to inflation. Do a dime tax, it would raise $500 million every year, and all that money would just go into roads. We'd have the best system in the world. And Woody, I'll ask you this. What would you rather do, spend $60 a year on a gasoline tax, because that's all it would be, or $200 and $300 and $400 for new tires, new alignments, and car repairs?
That's a no-brainer, I think.
It is a no-brainer. I'm for that gasoline tax, and I'm not running for statewide office.
Well, and transportation is also key to public safety.
Yes.
To the extent those roads aren't maintained, there are going to be more accidents. And also, it's key to maintaining our employment base here.
Yes.
And attracting new employers. Talk about that.
Well, that's exactly right, because businesses are going to go where they can have an educated workforce. So if you're diverting money away from education, you hurt your ability to do that. They're going to go where they can move people and products, and if you are not subsidizing, if you're not taking care of your transportation needs, they can't do that. So they look at both together. And I think that highlights another problem with the governor's proposal. When you pit education against transportation rather than looking at a way to take care of both of those needs, then it's like you said, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and at the end of the day, you're not creating a total package that businesses are going to look at and say, yeah, that's where I want to go and put my business.
We've got a few remaining moments, but I want to focus a little bit on the Affordable Care Act and the options states have to create market exchanges. I know you've been involved in that to some extent, so I'll start with you.
Okay, yeah, I've put in legislation along with Delegate Patrick Hope, and I think there are a couple of other bills that would establish a Virginia exchange rather than defaulting to the federal government to do it. And it's gotten tied up in the politics. People who don't like the Affordable Care Act think, well, let's not do anything until we know whether or not it'll be struck down. The problem with that is, whether you like federal health care reform or not, creating a state exchange which creates a marketplace for individuals and small businesses to buy health insurance is a good idea. Second, the governor has already assumed that the federal act is going to remain by making budget decisions, assuming so. He has cut funding from free clinics with the belief that by the time the second year of the budget kicks in, they will be covered in the expanded Medicaid. So you can't have it both ways.
And of course, health care is a critical issue, especially for people who have become unemployed through no fault of their own. The Medicaid rolls are still swelling, and we're going to have to deal with those critical issues.
Right. The bottom line is this: irrespective of whether or not you're a supporter of the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act, often referred to as Obamacare, or not, an exchange makes sense. You know, those people that have small businesses, and I have small businesses, you want to be able to avail yourself through the economies of scale of being able to go to an exchange and buy a policy for your group that is affordable. So forget about the act, whether it passes or not, and I agree with Jennifer. The governor has already made decisions based on the fact that he thinks the Patient Protection Act will pass. But even if we don't get there, let's have the exchanges, let's have them in Virginia, let's be leaders.
Pension reform is again back on the table this session. What's likely to happen?
There's a real consensus, I think, that we have to fully fund VRS. We can't ever do what we did a couple of years ago and withhold over $600 million to VRS, because there's too many state employees that are depending on that.
That's the Virginia retirement system.
Yes. And I think it was a good start that we made existing employees and new employees both pay the same amount into VRS. But that's the lifeblood of our retired folk, and we can't shortchange that.
Defined benefit versus defined contribution. That's kind of those are the buzzwords.
It is, and I think the JLARC report that came out in December is very instructive. That our current system was set up because the salaries that we pay our employees is not competitive with the private sector. So to make up that difference, we've had very generous pension plans, a defined benefit plan. And any effort to move to a defined contribution plan, any effort to increase the amount that employees have to pay into the system threatens our ability to be competitive with the private sector. But I also want to point out, VRS did not get underfunded because of anything that state employees did. VRS is underfunded because of the budget gimmicks that the General Assembly decided to do. When it didn't fund VRS at the level that the actuaries recommended that we do, when we borrowed $600 million to balance the budget rather than putting that in VRS. And so to balance the VRS budget on the back of our state employees now is fundamentally unfair. It breaks our promises to them, and we need to find another way to fund VRS.
Very quickly, how can we contact you during the session?
Call my office, 698-1074. I'm one of many delegates that think that the most important thing that we do is take care of our constituents' problems. So we're available during session and after session, and we welcome visits and certainly welcome telephone calls.
Delegate?
698-1171 or 1071.
Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Delegate Joe Morrissey, and you, thank you for being here again.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Good job, Woody.